still haunted by his past. Former British Premier Tony Blair has been accused of being a war criminal during an inquiry over his relationship with the media.
Excuse me, this man should be arrested for war crimes. JP Morgan paid him off for the Iraq war 3 months after we invaded Iraq. He held up the Iraq bank for $20 billion. He was then paid $6 million every year and still is from JP Morgan 6 months after he left office. The man is a war criminal.
The protester was forcibly removed after entering the Leveson inquiry courtroom at the Royal Court of Justice. Blair is answering questions about whether he struck a deal with the media mogul Rupert Murdoch. He was asked about phone conversations between him and Murdoch days before the war in Iraq. Blair's critics say he made the phone calls to win the support of Murdoch's newspapers for the attack. He says there is nothing odd about the calls to Murdoch before the war. A group of protesters have also gathered outside the courtroom demanding Blair stand trial for taking Britain into war with Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, the protester you saw in that report right now in the Leveson inquiry was David Lawley-Wakelin. He's a documentary filmmaker and he's joining us now live from London to share his thoughts with us. Mr. Wakelin, welcome. You interrupted the Leveson inquiry as Tony Blair was testifying and you called Blair a war criminal. First of all, why don't you elaborate for us why you think he's a war criminal?
Well, I think it's become very clear to all of us, many people in this country, that Blair, in fact, made money from invading Iraq, from oil companies and from JP Morgan. If you look on Google, JP Morgan and the Iraq Bank, 3 months after we invaded, or England invaded Iraq, the JP Morgan and a lot of other American banks supported the Iraqi bank for about $20 billion to just uphold the country until the war would be over, and then they could pay them back by mortgaging the oil. Then just 6 months after he left office, Blair was started to be paid $6 million a year, and this is through a BBC website. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a fact that he was paid $6 million a year, and still is probably, by JP Morgan for advice. So it smacks of corruption. The fact that I think he thought, and Bush thought, that they would get away with that war. Just in the same year as we invaded, Bush was on that USS Enterprise saying that it was mission accomplished, and they didn't think that by the time Blair left office, some 6 years later, that he would be, the bombs would still be going off, a massive civil war would be there, and 500,000 people or more would have lost their lives, whilst he was still being paid by oil companies from Iraq. And, of course, the Kuwaiti royal family gave him a massive gift of millions, as well as a few other oil companies ever since. And there's a lot of people in this country who understand now that he did it for his own ends.
Well, Mr. Wakelin, when you did make that comment there in the Leveson inquiry, JP Morgan paid Blair off for the Iraq war. Mr. Blair himself said that, for the record, I want to say that that is not true. You say that in your reference there, this is something, for instance, that the BBC has reported. According to some estimates, over 1 million people, of course, were killed in the wars that Tony Blair and George W. Bush waged in Afghanistan and Iraq. Do you have any hopes that he may one day appear at The Hague, for instance, for war crimes, to face evidence or to defend himself when he says, for instance, right now, well, those allegations against me, they're not true? Do you think that there will be a time when he has to face a court of law on this and defend himself?
Well, first of all, I think it's great and amazing to think that, one activist who breaks into the Leveson inquiry has shocked Blair enough for him to have to say anything. If he was innocent, surely he would just ignore it. But the fact that he's quickly jumped up and said, no, it's not true, is like somebody with a guilty conscience, whether he ever gets to court, that's another thing. It's taking on the American government, Bush and Blair and the British government. It's just an enormous thing. There are lots of websites where you can join petitions to get Blair indicted for war crimes, and perhaps one day we can hope that he will be taken down to The Hague. But it's a long road, and we can only hope that it'll happen. There's plenty of evidence to point towards it. The sad thing is that the Chilcot inquiry over here in England, or which is known as the Iraq inquiry, won't be looking at any criminal activity. They'll only be making inquiry into what went wrong in the decision-making by the politicians and the government and putting guidelines towards that. But they won't be looking at all the money that washed around at the time and that Blair is still making.
OK, Mr. David Lawley-Wakelin, documentary filmmaker, joining us there live from London. Thank you very much for being with us.